Welcome, everyone. Jenara and here with Divergent Ideas, our new series. And I'm super excited for today's guest, Peter Savodnik, who's had an incredible international career, is now senior editor at the Free Press, covers some very interesting trends in society and intellectual interests and where we're at politically. Super excited to hear from you, Peter. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here.
Yeah, so let's start with your, like I mentioned, very international kind of winding career and how you ended up at the Free Press.
Let's see. Excuse me. I'd always wanted to spend a lot more time in Eastern Europe, and over the course of the 90s and the early aughts, I kept pushing farther eastward. And so I spent a lot of time in Germany, Poland, Eastern Europe, Hungary, Czech Republic, elsewhere. And then I wound up through a variety of fellowships and then stories and opportunities getting myself to Russia, which was the weirdly kind of like the sort of the goal. That's what I had aspired to, and to be able to report from Russia. And it probably had to do with a variety of reasons. You know, my grandfather on my father's side, whom I had never known, had come from a little shtetl, well, a city in what is now Belarus, but other family members had come from, kind of rural parts of the old kind of Russian Empire, and so I had this sort of fascination with that part of the world and um, the sort of kind of Jewish emigre experience, and so that was all very interesting to me. And Russia was fascinating to me, and I think it because it felt quasi sort of unhinged. There is no real sort of like stable legal code. There is no jurisprudence in the way that we think of it. Things felt much more dangerous, and that was its own kind of riveting excitement. And so, I wound up in Moscow, and I was there at first just for 2 years, and then I wound up getting more assignments. And then while I was back there, I was based in New York, but then I wound up getting an assignment back in Moscow. And while I was there, I met my now wife, who was at the U.S. Embassy. And so Kate was there. And then the challenge for me was to figure out how to figure out how to spend more time in the former Soviet Union while she was there. And so I wound up pitching a book, which I wrote. I was based in Minsk. And then that was convenient because I could go kind of back and forth between Minsk and Moscow. It's just an overnight train ride away or a flight. And and that was actually, very, very nice. It was a very exciting period in terms of reporting and the work. Uh, and then that was sort of the crux of it. But that was the beginning of it. And what was exciting in terms of travel and work was that Kate, my wife, was much more experienced had done more work in the Middle East. And so that sort of forced me then to think more, travel more in that part of the world. And so that kind of opened up a kind of vista that previously I hadn't really been exposed to. So, I had felt like I had seen a lot in the former Soviet Union, Central Asia, the Caucasus, the Baltics, Ukraine, a lot, and of course Belarus, and then Kate, we wound up going to Sri Lanka, but then I was doing a lot of reporting in the Gulf and Israel and Egypt, and so it was an exciting period.
Amazing. Well, speaking of international adventures, and I want to apologize for anyone listening, but I'm also abroad in Kathmandu, Nepal, and like I live right next to like raging motorcycles and whatnot. If anyone can hear anything in the background, but that's so cool. So you went from so you eventually ended up in Sri Lanka, and then was that kind of your last international post before making it back to the States?
Yeah, we were in Sri Lanka for 2 years, and then we wound up. Kate was at USAID, and so we wound up coming back to Washington. And then for family related reasons, we wound up going coming out here to LA because my family was here, is here, and so we came out here, and we didn't think that we would stay that long, and that was 11 years ago. So in that time, uh, both our kids have been born. They have, we're on our third house. We've sort of settled in. But I think that, we both love traveling a lot. And I think that at some point we will probably try to figure out some way to make that happen, like in a more prolonged way than just, going overseas for a week or two. So we'll see.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you say that. As I've been kind of chronicling heterodox journalists over the last few years, I just, wrote this book that was all about groupthink. So I wanted to better understand heterodox writers and kind of what the personality is there. And a very common theme actually was this international orientation. What do you make of that? Do you think that just having broader exposure helps you kind of hold a lot more complexity in terms of forming one's views, or what do you think?
Yeah, I've talked about this with my wife a lot. I think so. Yes, I think that if you spend time abroad, then it gives you a lot of perspective on all things culture war in the United States, and you realize very quickly that things that we fight about here and we squabble over are, I mean, microscopic in the bigger context of things. So, I've been in heated exchanges with sources and editors and fellow journalists about things like uh, pronouns and whatever. And my question always is, have you ever tried being you in XYZ country? Because you should try that. You should see what that's like. And it's not to excuse bad behavior here in the United States or sort of narrow-mindedness, myopia, whatever, but it is to, to try to impose a bit of perspective. Uh, and look, there are things that are, you know, it's not simply like about like sort of like the good that you go away from the United States and then you come back and you realize that things are much better here. There are lots of things that we don't have. There are things that are missing. There are things that I long for that I remember with great fondness about my times, especially in the former Soviet Union. Uh, but but it also, I think, it forces one to think a little bit more deeply about, what is it to live here? Like, what is it like? And how does it really differ from other places? And what are the things that really matter? And to pay attention to details in a way that I wouldn't otherwise. I remember the first time I went on a reporting trip in Russia, it was, I think, 2002 or two, I think. And I remember being fascinated by, like, I was in this man's apartment, and he was in this old, like, Brezhnev era, like, apartment in this complex in Kaliningrad. And, you know, the apartment was like not all that spectacular, but I was fascinated by all the details because it was alien to me. And it was only after I came back to the United States, I thought, well, if you paid attention to things here with the same kind of intensity or scrupulousness, you might actually see things that you would otherwise miss. And so in that way, actually, it lent, I think, a certain kind of intensity or I don't know, energy to my reporting here in the United States.
That makes a lot of sense. And then now that you're back in the States, and I had a similar path to you. I was back in the States for about a decade, and then my family and I moved back to Asia where we had been previously for 6 years. Do you feel being back in the States, because you talked about details, do you feel like things are a bit more mundane or monotonous, and so it's harder to stay so attuned or have your senses so heightened?
No, not now. I don't. I I feel like right now in the United States there is a multi-front war of ideas taking place over the soul of the nation, and I feel alternately kind of horrified by some of what's going on, but also very fortunate to be here and to witness it and to be able to report on it. So I guess I feel a mix of things, but I no, I think I would probably feel very upset with myself if I were not in the United States right now, if I were not here. I think this is the place to be because at least for me, because uh, it's my home and I love America and I am very, very worried about where we are going and what is happening to us. And I want to report on that. I want to write about it uh, because I think that that matters. I think that I don't want to overstate sort of the importance of journalism, but I think that like good journalism can matter, and I want to help in whatever way I can, however small that may be, to try to nudge things in a particular direction.
That's really interesting. Can you say more about what's at stake in terms of the soul of the nation?
Yeah, of course. I think that like we've been locked in this partisan left-right divide for now so many years. It's going on a few decades. And what's happened is that it's sort of like Freud's idea of the narcissism of minor differences. Up until 2016, the differences between the parties were narrowing with each successive cycle. So you got to 2012, and for all intents and purposes, there was technically a party of the right and a party of the left, but the substantive differences were minuscule. Obama's well, Republicans were fired up about Obamacare, but Obamacare, of course, was based on Romney Care. He was running against Romney in 2012, so it was hard to sort of like see this as like a great sort of ideological chasm or a showdown, the way that the partisans would have us believe. And then along comes Donald Trump in 2016, who basically blows up the charade um, for better and for worse. Mostly for worse, although there's, I think, some good. Well, it's hard for me to say whether it was intended or not, but it's what's happened, I think, is that there's been this explosion of the guardrails on the right and this corporatization of the left, and we now have really, I think, kind of four parties in America. There's a liberal and illiberal faction in both parties. So you have, I think, old-fashioned liberals, like Democrats who sort of kind of like Mike Dukakis Democrats, but they're basically impotent. And you mostly have then this kind of progressive identitarian strain that's predominant in the on the kind of corporatized left, and uh, and then you have on the Republican side, you have this you know, uh, you had this populist, quasi-illiberal streak for a while that's now become much more illiberal and is openly flouting constitutional democratic norms. There's the lawfare. There's the you the just the targeting of political rivals and just all the kind of um, frankly, just like dangerous stuff, the kind of erosion of the soft tissue of the democracy, all the norms and kind of habits that we were accustomed to that made for the like sort of a stable republic feel like they are now much more fluid. And so I think what's happening is that we are being forced to ask ourselves, who do we want to be? What kind of country do we want to live in? And I want to live in a country in which, we are all free to argue passionately about things like tax, rates and, uh, environmental policy and foreign policy, but not the First Amendment, and not due process, and so forth. And I worry a great deal that those things are under fire. So, uh, yeah, that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, well put. And so what do you think is the role of journalism and media right now, and in particular the free press, which has
Yeah.
done a really incredible job, and you've had an amazing sort of set of coverage there in your role as senior editor. So what are your thoughts on the media landscape right now?
I mean, look, the the media. So the, I, I don't really know what to say about most legacy media, except for CBS, because I don't really know how people think inside like the senior like uppermost echelons at the New York Times or NBC or CNN or whatever. What I feel is that they've done an abysmal job over the past decade, more, but especially the past decade. And so, now we're in this position where there is there is essentially zero trust in legacy media outside of kind of like aging boomer liberal circles. So if you are in the Rachel Maddow like kind of orbit, then you care about what's on the front page of the New York Times. But if the New York Times reported tomorrow that there was a comet headed straight toward Earth, I don't know that, three-quarters of the country would actually believe that there was a comet headed straight toward the Earth. I hope they would, but I don't know. And so, I think like look, a lot of that is the Times' fault and all legacy media, but it's also the fault of our institutions, it's the fault of the culture, it's the fact that you know, for 4 or 5 decades now, we've had this kind of thoroughly postmodernized education on campus. And so, like we've been telling young people at elite schools, there's no such thing as the truth. So, okay, we've now arrived at a point where there is no truth, there are no judgments, there are no moral hierarchies. So we can't say that anything is for sure, everything's a matter of opinion, subjective, etc. So, and that has now seeped into across the right, which is how you get the woke right. And so, yeah, we are confined right now to this Tower of Babel, and the I think the role of the good journalists, and there are, I think, some really great people out there doing really important work, uh, is simple. It's to report the truth, and it's to say, to acknowledge, like we don't know many, like most things we don't know about. We don't know the truth, so we can say we don't know. We don't. We're on. But to report honestly and to be curious and to ask as many questions as possible and to be skeptical, all the things that made journalism exciting and meaningful in the first place, that's what's needed. And it's not actually a mystery. There's nothing new here. It's just about journalists returning to journalism. And to be fair, there's a lot of great journalism that has been happening at the legacy institutions. It's just that the leadership in a lot of these places has been at best weak, wobbly, vacillating, and so you have stories that wind up undermining then the whole brand of the publication, and that deeply hurts the sort of the so-called good journalism because people don't know what they should believe or not believe, which I think is it's obviously very dangerous. It's sad, etc. So, anyway, bottom line is I think journalists have a lot of work to do, and I've got my fingers crossed.
Yeah, I think in my view, the downfall, I think, has, and this, some people might say this is overly simplistic, but thinking back, and being kind of an elder or millennial and, starting my own career actually with Fast Company magazine, sort of like early online, really fast-paced journalism. I think the image that comes to mind is like bowing down to the clicks,
Right.
and I think once that kind of took over our minds, took over the managers, took over leadership, with that becoming the kind of primary goal, like how many views did this piece get, and all of that. In my view, that seemed to be like the beginning of it, and I think that we kind of didn't have a captain. We didn't have anyone steering the ship in a way, broadly speaking. Um, and so sort of just letting the clicks and, and then, later social media and the algorithms kind of taking over and dictating what gets published, but really dictating what people think and how people think. That seems to be the dumbing down of the media and journalists themselves, frankly. And so I think it's taken individual actors to kind of press pause on that and think for themselves. And I think it's
Hmm.
scary that not more of that has happened. Um, and I think that in some ways this is a generational thing. And I do think that it's also a life experience thing, going back to like people who actually had more on the ground
Yeah.
experience internationally and whatnot. What do you think?
I mean, I think that what happened in the mid to late aughts, especially with the advent of social media and the smartphone, is that the elder statesmen inside legacy media got terrified that they were going to become irrelevant, and so they changed the hiring practices. So it used to be right that like you would start out the way I did. You get a job at some little rinky-dink paper in the middle of nowhere. Then you would work up to like some regional paper. Then eventually you'd get like a job at like the Loudoun County Bureau, the Washington Post, and then you'd break a bunch of like news, on like the planning commission in, outermost, like sort of like the suburbs of Washington, D.C. Eventually you get to the Metro desk and eventually you get to the national desk, at which point you're, probably in your early 40s and you've broken a bunch of news. You are a very skilled practitioner of journalism and your bosses are all in their 50s and 60s, and there's a kind of crankiness and a certain kind of staidness and stolid quality about the institution. And I think what happened is when they got scared that they were going to become irrelevant, they were hemorrhaging readers, they were hemorrhaging influence. They said we have to bring in young people who are, digital natives, which is code for ignoramus, usually, not always. And so they brought in a lot of people who are younger who didn't actually know how to do how to report, and they also didn't really understand what it meant to um like why are we here? What are we doing here? And the thing is, if you came of age in this moment where you didn't really believe in fact, because the whole notion of fact or moral judgment was always sort of like a silly, backward, sort of like definitely, not what one, learned or was, kind of imbued with at elite universities in America in the 90s and the aughts and to this day. Um, then you combine that with this sort of vagueness about or ambiguity about sort of the nature of the mission, and so then suddenly the mission shifts from reporting to activism. And of course, that becomes more that's helped along by, as you mentioned, the appetite for the hunger for clicks. That kind of quote journalism, close quote, drives a lot more in the way of traffic. And then of course the politics play off the media. They kind of they shape each other. And as the politics ratcheted up, as this kind of like again, the narcissism of minor differences, sort of intensify, and there's this feeling of this Manichaean showdown that's kind of looming on the horizon. If the number of times I've been at a convention or covering a presidential campaign or a campaign, and one of the contenders says, "This is the most important election of our lifetime." I can't recall how many, and I actually would be more inclined at this point to vote for the candidate, whoever the candidate may be, who said, you know what, this is actually not the most important election of our lifetime. The most important election of our lifetime will be the one when we really have to decide between this or burning the Constitution. And I don't think this is that election. I think that's I hope not like for several cycles or decades or centuries to come. But everything is has been turned into this kind of absurd theater, um and so that, coupled with the age, coupled with the lack of education and the credentials, make for this really, I think, toxic cauldron in which we more or less sort of lost sight of the reporting and sort of traditional journalism and allowed activism and opinion and clicks to eclipse everything else. And the magic of the free press has been that basically Barry solved this problem that had been people have been trying to solve for basically 2 decades, 2.5 decades, which is how can media, create a successful business off the internet. And every every idea prior to the free press had been some kind of gimmick or reconfiguration of the technology, or this or that, like vertical or listicle or whatever. It never seemed to occur to anyone that actually what we're going to do is just old-fashioned journalism, and there's actually a lot of appetite out there for that, and that's what we've done. And it turns out that that's been a winning proposition.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in my mind, I think free press is one of the only entities that's been able to do that. And then, my mind goes to the individual journalists, the writers who've gone solo on Substack. And I wonder your thoughts on that and what the prospects are of that. I think what I've seen is some really good reporting, thoughtful writing. I guess I get concerned that the role of editors has kind of gone
Right,
out the window. And that was always my concern with,
right,
even like the early blogging on Medium and then especially with Substack. I mean, even for myself, like I love having editors. It's such a huge part
right.
of this job, right? And it's kind of like, oh, you're just on your own.
Right.
What do you think about, the sort of going
Yeah.
solo?
Um, no, I think, I mean, I still wonder like how many quotes have been fabricated that we had, read it on. So I mean, look, I'm not accusing anyone, but like I just, yeah, there's a real benefit, obviously, when you are writing for before it ever goes to publication, there are, depending on the publication, there are 5 to 10 people who are going to spend a lot of time poring over everything you have written. There's your, primary editor, there's backup editor, there are copy editors, then there's the editor in chief who's going to take a look at it. It's going to go to the art director. There are all kinds of people who are going to be invested in your story. And there's a lot of opportunity for someone to say, I don't think this is true, or I don't think this is exactly right. And that's obviously that's critical. So yeah, like I think that like, Substack has been great. And I think that there's a reason that it has flourished and taken off. The public was hungry for a much more colorful and meaningful and substantive journalism that defied the groupthink. I think the reason it took off is that we got to a point starting around like the late 20, the latter part of the second decade of the century. So like 2018, 2019, as you began to hit like peak woke, where you kind of knew what the kind of legacy media's take on any story was going to be. I mean, there was very little in the way of genuine surprise. And so I think that fed a lot of the public appetite for this because people wanted to, you know, I think there's a natural suspicion that, life is actually not doesn't fit neatly into some kind of the political framing that whatever legacy publication has provided for you. And then on top of that, it just gets boring. Like if it's not entertaining, if it doesn't evoke anything in you, if it doesn't make you rethink any of your prior beliefs or whatever, then what good is this? What are we even doing here? And if no one believes like the big scoop that you just landed, then what are we doing here? So I think like Substack was very exciting, and it obviously like it's played a critical role in the success of the free press. But I think that yeah, like, I think we'll see the emergence over time of new guardrails. As audience grows, people become, more carefully scrutinized, and the stakes grow. And I've noticed certain publications that started out early on as a little bit more reckless, a little bit more kind of off the cuff, have become a little bit more guarded, a little more careful, and I think that is on balance a very good thing. They're being more journalist, and less, sort of bloggers. So yeah,
Mhm.
so I mean, yeah, I think editors editors are often a good thing. It depends on who the editor is, but their editors are usually a good thing, and yeah, we want fewer mistakes, so and less lying. So yeah, it's good.
Yeah, and I mean, in addition to like fact checking and all of that, I think to me it's also about like the relationship that's at the center of that. Just the joy of being a writer, the joy of, observing the world and putting together your thoughts and then like sharing that with the world. It's good to just have some feedback and like sort of like collaborate and think through the
Yes.
angle and like whatnot. And it's kind of sad that there's like less of that now. Um,
Well, that was like for me, like one of the best parts about working with Barry and getting involved. First, it was Common Sense, and then we became the Free Press. Was that the journalists I worked with there were just they were great people. They are great people, and what makes them great is not that they agree with me about everything. In fact, a lot of them think that I'm crazy, and vice versa. But they're smart and wonderful, and they think about things in ways that I don't. And there's this kind of respect and comity, and and for all those reasons, you wind up with an infinitely better final draft, final product. And it reminds me a lot of work I did for some of the magazines that I was most excited to work with way back in the like the aughts when I was in mostly in Russia, Wired and Harper's and the Atlantic, where we had like really, really excellent editors and thoughtful people, and the conversations were always really rich. That changed over the course of the second decade, not with those people, but with some of the same publications. And so joining the team at the Common Sense and the Free Press was a little bit like kind of coming in from the cold and going back to something which I felt very familiar with.
that makes sense. Yeah, I can see that. And I think that's why a lot of people are drawn to your publication. So speaking of, what have been some of your favorite stories or sort of trends that you've been able to document since you've covered such a wide range of topics?
So I love looking at sort of the intersection between politics and culture and the ways in which that they kind of play off of and influence each other. And the and so I guess the story when I think about like the stories that I'm most excited about or the ones that like I feel like have had like a longer shelf life because as journalism is kind of has like journalism has a woefully short life or shelf life. So that, something that you were very proud of 6 months ago, you might not be as proud of, when you reread it or whatever. But no, I think, look, one of the first pieces I did that I was very excited about was in early, there are a number of pieces, but um, trends, developments in our politics. So going back to very early 2024, I did a piece on what we call the Great Scramble, and the idea behind the Great Scramble was that we we talk about the left and the right and Democrats and Republicans, but these words have been sapped of their meaning because the way that we think of like the left doesn't correspond with the things that people on the left today believe, and the same applies to people on the right. The old words, old language, the old compartments have been blown up. And what happens is that because we continue to work within the old language categories, we wind up creating far more confusion than actually, dispelling, which is a big problem. And we've yet to devise a new vocabulary for describing sort of, what we believe and how we organize ourselves politically, culturally, and so forth. And I started looking at voters who's kind of like the potpourri of beliefs they had did not, or I should say like the mashup of beliefs that they had in their head d didn't fit neatly into either of the two major party camps. So um you know the woman who comes to mind is the sort of the lesbian trucker who is the Trump voter, who was also very worried about the climate, like felt very, very deeply about like the kids who were dying in Gaza and Ukraine, but did not think it was our problem. Was very worried about infrastructure in America, but also wanted to know like why like factories were shutting down, and so but it was also kind of pro-choice. But then like like Podosa didn't like people being like, I think she saw it like sort of exploiting their kind of abortion rights. I'm not sure exactly what she had in mind by that, but whatever the case, what I liked so much about Shelley was that she did not conform to my idea, anyone's idea of what a Trump voter was supposed to be, or then she became a Biden voter. I think she's now, I don't know if she's back to being a Trump voter, but the point is that like it defied expectation. And it turns out that there are a lot of people like her. And the parties and the media had yet to catch up with that. So that story was very exciting to me because it was sort of us, the free press, charting like telling people we need a new vocabulary, we need a new way of talking about our politics. And in the absence of that, we're going to continue fighting about things that we don't actually believe, or we're going to assign beliefs, opinions to people in another camp who that aren't necessarily there. Anyway, so I found all that very exciting. I did a lot of reporting on the reaction to October 7th and Hamas attack, and more importantly on the reaction to that here in the United States and what that said, and that is kind of carried over into this coverage that I've been more focused on over the past year, looking into sort of this emergence of like this nihilistic strain in our politics and the rise of political violence and who these people are who are doing terrible things, killing people wantonly and for no apparent reason. And so yeah, I guess all that is what I'm most proud of and most excited by.
Yeah, definitely. I know what you mean now when you were, earlier in our conversation, you were saying this is such a pivotal moment and you'd be sad if you weren't here covering all this. And, I agree. And so much of this it's very real and tangible, but it's also like very kind of cerebral and intellectual in many ways. It is this war of ideas that people are not always aware of. Some of what you were describing with the scramble is a bit of like a linguistic issue, right? It's like a linguistic framing of how we're thinking about these words of left and right and what do they even mean now, especially as people increasingly kind of embody aspects of both and how amazing and beautiful that is, but also very confusing at times. And
I mean, I think,
tend to
yeah, sorry.
I tend to think of this as kind of like a couple or something, and why people fight so much, even though they actually agree on a lot of stuff. And I think sometimes that people just don't know what to do with themselves. And I think that there is so much more agreement in terms of the public, in terms of like the left and the right, but because our politics is so divided and so polarized between only two options, it makes it really hard to talk about the things that we actually agree on. And the person that you mentioned, I think, is a perfect example, like someone who can kind of pick and choose. And in reality, many people are more nuanced thinkers than we give them credit for.
Yes, yes. I think the vast majority of voters, when you actually kind of, you know, talk with them and ask them questions, good faith questions, and stop and sort of dispense with the categories and the assumptions and the labels, and you just ask them about their lives. They never fit neatly into the caricature. They never they're never it's never that simple. And we I think we like that, right? Like the caricature is very reassuring because it enables us to hold on to whatever our beliefs are, whatever our politics are. If I'm like a partisan Democrat, then it's important that I believe that everyone who voted for Donald Trump is a racist, xenophobic, troglodyte, and that's it. And there's really nothing else. And I don't want to have any more conversation about this. We're done. Well, that's just stupid. I mean, it's phenomenally stupid and ignorant. And similarly, if you're in MAGA, I think there's I don't know if there's I think they're a little bit I think a lot of people sort of in the Republican universe are a little bit confused about who the Democrats are right now because there's a lack of leadership and it's really not clear what Democrats believe in. I don't really know actually why the Democratic Party exists right now except to oppose whatever the Republicans want to do.
Mhm.
Um, uh, but I guess we're going to find out soon, or at some point. We'll see. But so I think there's a lot of confusion. But yeah, I mean, people love caricature, they love stereotype, they love that kind of, it's a crutch. And I love, as much as possible blowing that up or complicating it.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So speaking of the Democrat Party, what do you think? This is coming up in other conversations I've been having, and it is tricky to kind of envision what the path forward is. I think of many angles here, but one is like, it seems like there needs to be a larger sense of bravery to kind of name some of the trends that you're pointing out and kind of not being afraid to speak up for the truth instead of like bowing to some kind of groupthink narrative. What are your thoughts?
About Democrats, you mean?
Yeah, like the future of the Democratic Party.
Well, so there's now this emerging schism in the Democratic Party between the sort of, the kind of corporatized majority, which controls the institutions, and then this kind of group of upstarts who are led by, I think now it's fair to say, Zohran Mamdani, who are coming in from the left and who are proposing some things and are attached to some people and groups' ideas that are pretty repugnant. And so the question for Democrats is there a way to forge a substantive, meaningful politics that harkens back to or draws on the old liberal tradition, liberal in the kind of 19th century sense of the word, and liberal in the kind of Democratic Party sense of the word, and at the same time dispenses with or kind of guardrails against the tribalism, the anti-Semitism, the racial identitarianism, all the things that have made the left, I think, so unsavory to very large numbers of voters who have flocked to sort of the MAGA universe. Uh, and that remains to be seen because right now you've got this again this schism which is opening up, and I don't know how that resolves itself. Uh,
Yeah.
but the only reason that Democrats, I think, have for now at least a fighting chance of holding on to a good bit of power is that the Republicans are also in the midst of cannibalizing themselves. And so, you know, that presents Democrats with an opportunity. What I'm waiting to see and I guess what I hope for late at night when I'm when I'm like typing is there going to be is either of the parties going to figure out how to forge this kind of liberal majority, again, liberal in the sense of liberal versus illiberal, in there being this idea of four parties. There's a liberal Democratic faction, a liberal Republican faction. Is there someone who's going to come along and says, look, we may disagree about things like, abortion, but guess what? That's not actually that important right now because Roe's been overturned. We live in the era of Dobbs, so let's focus on the things that really matter, like uh, again, civil liberties, uh, a foreign policy that reflects sort of like traditional American or like kind of values, our pluralism, our liberalism, our individualism. Uh, is someone like that going to come along? I think what's so far made that very hard is that's not really an agenda as much as a kind of like a kind of a lovely poem. Um, and so it's hard to run on that. Uh, but I know that there are members of both parties who are thinking about things like that. Whether or not they can make that happen remains to be seen.
Okay, I guess I have two questions. One is, what do you think about the schisms that are happening on the right now? My
Yeah.
second question is from a branding and marketing perspective for the left. I think there's like so much of an image issue here. I think when I think about, the prominent podcasters emerging, that eventually went right, like Rogan and this kind of sense of economic unease in the United States, I think demands or catalyzes like a form of leadership that feels big and strong, right? And that reassures people. And the
Yeah.
left doesn't have that right now, but the right does. So do you have a sense of what form that might take on the left? Like, I just don't see, I'm talking literally like visual imagery, like the big muscles, the like not backing down. That just seems to be
Right.
so antithetical to the left right now, but at the same time, it seems like something that we actually need.
Yeah, no, we do. Well, first of all, I don't know that the right is really, they are, as I said, I think they are in the midst of a sort of an emergent civil war, and so I don't know that there is like a clear kind of moral vision, there as well, and there's this kind of there's the crisis of like the Groypers and Christian nationalism, and I think there really is this like very serious problem. I don't know how the extent of the problem because I don't, it's hard to know exactly the numbers, but there's a generational divide and on the right, and there's a generational divide on the left as well, but I think on the left it's it's a little bit um I don't know. It's interesting. The with the Democrats, I mean, um, let me see. I'm thinking out loud. I think with the Democrats, like the challenge is that they they don't know how to they've forgotten what it means to lead. They don't have like I think to your point, like there is this weird I mean, for lack of a better way of putting it, like, sort of like feminization of the party that has happened so that like everyone feels the need to sort of like be very respectful and check in. And there's a kind of there's a this like it feels often like when you speak to like Democratic bundlers and influencers, it's like they alternate between being enraged toddlers who can't believe that Donald Trump is doing something that he said he was going to do, or there is this kind of kind of kindergarten teacher quality to them. What's not there are just sort of like adults saying, "This is what we believe in, and this is how we're going to get there, and this is why we should go there." And you're either with us or against us, and it's really kind of that simple. With the Republicans, I guess you could say I don't know if they're better or worse off. They know how to do those things, but there are now these emerging camps, and very distinct camps. And um, you know, I think the 2028 presidential primary is going to be fascinating because we can already see the delineations and how that we can sort of anticipate sort of to some degree how that's going to unfold. A lot is obviously going to happen between now and then, but I think you're going to see a very, very heated Republican primary, the likes of which we haven't seen, I don't think ever. So that'll be fascinating and fun to cover.
Yeah, yeah, I know what you mean. I'm so curious to see what's going to happen. Going
Right.
back to what you were saying about the left, and I agree, and I think the word usage is tough, right? Like if we want to call it feminization, but I know what you mean, the kindergarten teacher sort of quality. It's it's funny because we do have this word on the left to sort of kind of like pop psych around like respectability politics. And I
Mhm.
think that since there's been such a counter movement against that, except like now the left completely embodies this respectability politics. Like you have to say certain things, and if you go out of line, then you're canceled, and blah 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 blah. Um, I don't know, like you're in LA. I'm curious what you're seeing on the ground in terms of the people who are willing to go against that, privately or publicly, in your schools, like PTA meetings and stuff. Because at the end of the day, this is a psychological characteristic, right? If people are not willing to have a backbone, I call it like having an emotional backbone. It's like being able to like toughen up a little bit and deal with reality and have conversations based on reality instead of a set of ideals that in the beginning I think were good in the sense of yes, let's have more respect for each other. Let's be, somewhat careful about things we say or whatever, but now it's just gone way too far. And so now we have to learn to toughen up and really develop our backbone and not be so scared. And like you said, really stand for something. And I think that's very, just psychologically speaking, that's attractive. I think humans are drawn to people who are confident in themselves and can rationally describe why they arrived at wherever they arrived at. So I don't know, do you have any thoughts on sort of the psychological trajectory?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know where things are going. I know that what's happened on the left is this idea that of you hear that this from psychiatrists I've spoken with, like suicidal empathy,
Mhm.
where, you know, the left has an impossible time asserting moral hierarchies. So the same people who, like wore the pink pussy hats in 2017 are then demonstrating for Hamas, which is waging war against a country that, by all standards, is infinitely better in every regard when it comes to women, gay rights, trans rights, every minority right in the world, including Palestinian rights. So I guess the question then becomes, well, how does this kind of upside downness happen? How is it that you start in one place and you wind up in another place? And I think the reason that happens is that we have the left, I should say, has an impossible time saying that's worse than that. Like that's not the way we do things. And that's how you get, like, the whole grooming gang story in Britain. It's how we, it's how we get into any number of these kind of cul-de-sacs where it's very difficult for people on the left to say I'm against that. Like unless it's clearly associated with someone on the right. If you can brand it Trump or right wing, then that's easy. Then you kind of fall into your tribal compartment and you're safe. But if it's somebody who is supposed to be, who fits into your kind of caricatured notion of what, the good people are supposed to be doing something bad, then suddenly you are kind of rendered a kind of a like an incompetent, or, like, incapable of asserting, moral difference. And that's hobbling. So I think the first thing the Democrats have to do is to reclaim that they have to discard everything that they learned in college, all the kind of post-structuralists, all the Derrida, Lyotard bullshit. They have to forget all that. They have to forget Orientalism and Foucault and Fanon and all that stuff, and they have to, like, ask themselves, okay, what do I believe? Why are certain things better than others? Do I want to live in a country in which it's okay to, think of women as chattel? I think that's bad. Do I live in a country in which religious minorities are persecuted? No, I think that's bad. Do I believe in a rule of law? I think that's good. Like, in other words, like, return to their kind of their first principles.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, what I hear and what I think about a lot, even as you're talking, is just getting a better hold on reality and like really
Yeah,
allowing ourselves to see. And I think that's tough, right? I think that so many of us, we grow up naive and we have these ideals about the world, and then like you said, you go to university and it kind of reinforces certain ideals, and so that becomes very comfortable. And I think it's frankly hard and painful to actually look at the state of the world and human nature sometimes, and to kind of let that all dawn on you and realize, okay, things are different than what I thought when I was younger. How do I process this? How do I metabolize this and kind of deal with reality, deal with the current set of circumstances that are facing us as a human species? I think that's a
right,
very daunting task that most people are not prepared to do. Frankly, I don't think people are trained to do that. I think, like, from a parenting perspective, as well as an educational perspective. And so I think that's when you get this kind of really wild, contradictory set of ideas and viewpoints embodied in one person that don't really match the way the world really is. So I don't know, it
right.
seems like this is a larger philosophical task. And I've been thinking about it a lot, and it's definitely like kind of a long game, long game endeavor.
It is. It's also just a return to common sense. You know, if you set aside your again like your sort of ideological compartments, if you sort of free yourself of the strictures of ideology, and you just ask yourself, well, what kind of world do I want to live in? Then I think it becomes much easier, actually. I want to live in a world in which civil liberties are the rule of law, or the norm, I should say, and they are enforced by way of rule of law. I want to live in a world in which all human beings are free to achieve themselves. I accept that there are differences between human beings, between groups, that there are always going to be tensions and hatreds, animosities. That's central to the or inherent to the human condition. I can't make that go away, but I can create more opportunity and enable each successive generation to do things, to imagine sort of possibilities that prior generations could not have. All that seems to me kind of commonsensical. And so the question then, when it comes to thinking about the world and like charting a new politics or forging a new politics, is okay, like what kind of, like what does that look like concretely? What kind of like set of policies, are going to help, bring that into reality. And I feel like there's been for a long time on sort of in the organized left this inability to think constructively about building anything positive. It's been just about opposing Trump and all that, which I get, but at the same time, it doesn't provide for much in the way of a vision.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that's a great ending point. I think that, I think the task is still kind of getting people out and having real world experiences, and kind of goes back to the beginning of our conversation about when you kind of get out of your bubble, when you are internationally, when you live in such different settings, I think you have a much more tangible sense of the possibility of human and political trajectories. And I think when people stay inside their bubble, they can't even imagine something going awry. You mentioned people envisioning a world of greater civil liberties and not feeling at risk of losing those. I think until you get outside of your bubble, you don't even realize that that's like a possibility. So,
That's right.
yeah, it's my concluding thoughts. Well, it was so great to chat with you, and thank you so much for being.
Likewise. Thank you.